All right, hello everyone. Happy New Year. And here we are again, back online with the old kind of remote learning situation, which for art and design provides us with a few challenges, a few difficulties. Okay, not having the studios available and all the materials and things that we normally have to hand can be seen as something that could cause us a few problems. But also, interestingly, I think, it provides us with quite a few opportunities, because when you are not having to produce your work, when you're not having to kind of make things within the studios, you have a certain amount of kind of sort of freedom to do other things that you couldn't necessarily do if you were in class. So, for example, if you're taking photographs of things that are interesting to you and you're kind of in the studio, you're sort of stuck with whatever you happen to have around. At home, you can go for a walk, you can look around your own house. You've obviously got access to the internet at home to kind of, explore the world online. And so there are a number of kind of things actually working at home that can be quite helpful and quite beneficial to us. And particularly, actually, with the stage that you guys are at in terms of your GCSE project work. You are at a point now, having done the autumn term, exploring mark making, drawing, ways of, making images and responding to the world, strategies for kind of creating stuff. You've done all of that in the autumn term, and you've also started to look at artists and the work of other artists and how you can sort of respond to that with your own imaginative ideas. And really, where you're at now is you're in a position where we need to start work seriously on a personal project which is going to be distinctive and original and individual to you. So it's not something where everybody in the whole class is going to be doing the same thing anymore. We're now about making each of you your own unique individual artist, setting off down a path towards a series of creative outcomes. Okay, so it's like you're setting off at the beginning of a journey of kind of personal creative discovery at this point. And what we need at the start of any journey like this is a bit of a direction. We need to have some sense of kind of the direction that we are setting off in at the beginning of this journey. Even if we don't know where we're going to end up, we need to have a purpose at the beginning. And the form that this is going to take is that we're going to ask you to choose a title and a direction for your personal creative projects. And we're going to ask you to choose that title and then start building up ideas in response to that title in your sketchbook in the first 2 weeks of term while you are at home. So this is about, setting off, okay, giving ourselves a purpose and a direction, pointing our imaginations in a particular direction and seeing where that takes us. So you have got a choice of 3 titles, okay, and you can choose any of these 3 titles. So I'm going to start off by saying a couple of words about each one. The first possible title is Inside and Outside. Now, each of these titles is going to be, or has been designed, to allow you to have some room for personal interpretation. What's important here is what these titles mean to you. So Inside and Outside, in the most obvious way, you might initially think, okay, inside and outside, so I can be inside the building or I can be outside the building. And I could maybe make work which is to do with things that I experience inside in interior spaces, and then maybe I could also, get outside and observe buildings and that sort of thing from the outside, and possibly build up something in response to that stuff. However, you can think about this idea in any number of other ways. For example, what happens if you think about inside from a kind of emotional, internal, mental point of view? Okay, so inside becomes about the thoughts and the ideas and the workings of a human brain, okay, the things that go on inside your head, and then the way in which those things are projected on the outside. So it's possible to interpret this title as being about emotion and about feeling and about kind of hidden forces that might kind of drive things from the inside out. So when you are choosing your title, be careful to think about that. Don't just opt for something immediately, particularly if it's not something that's very interesting to you. Think about what these titles could actually mean. So inside and outside, okay? And I've mentioned 2 possible ideas there, but there are countless other ways of interpreting that idea. Your next one, or your next possible option, is this: movement and control. Movement and control. I mean, we're experiencing a lot of control at the moment over our lives, and a lot of restriction to our movement. So maybe there's something in that, and the idea of social movement and social control, and the kind of physical limits that are placed on the world as we experience it at the moment. But maybe also you could think about this in terms of dance and expression and physical bodily movement and control. Maybe you could think about this in terms of the movement of particles through the air, or planetary bodies kind of orbiting and revolving around one another. Maybe you could think about movement on the tiniest level, okay? The movement of insects, or the movement of rain as it kind of trickles down the window. You might want to think about control from other angles as well, okay? You might want to think about kind of the idea of electronic control, and the way, or possibly social media and the way that exerts an element of control, perhaps. Okay, so you've got, again, many ways of thinking about that. And the third option is this: construction and collapse. And by now you're probably thinking, hopefully you are anyway, oh yeah, construction. So that could mean buildings and scaffolding and architecture. But maybe it could also be about nature and the way that nature is constructed. Collapse might be to do with something environmental, but it might also be to do with, say, the construction and collapse of an idea, okay, or a lie, or a truth, or a system of some kind. So you've got all sorts of possible ways of interpreting these things. And initially, at least, you may not know exactly how you're going to interpret the theme, so long as there is potential there, as long as it starts firing your imagination. Okay? In many ways, it's best not to decide on an exact interpretation of the theme to begin with. But if you've got lots of ideas that start spilling out when you start thinking about one of these things, then that's probably a pretty good place to start. And this title, as I said before, and I'm going to keep saying, is about setting the course, setting the initial course of your ideas. But in terms of where you're going to end up on this journey, you really don't know. And that is the whole kind of essence, I suppose, of creativity and art and creative thinking. So when you've chosen your title, we're going to ask you then to start work in your sketchbook. Now, I've got here an example of some sketchbook pages that I've made, which are designed to show you how we would like your book to start looking as your title develops and as your theme is explored and as your work progresses. So you're going to continue working in your sketchbook, but now you're going to start guiding your ideas in response to your title. Now, last year when I made most of this stuff, one of the titles was Shapes of the City. So my series of pages begins with this title here, Shapes of the City, but yours will begin with your chosen title. And it's up to you how to present that in your sketchbook. But I would suggest that you start thinking at this point that everything in your book, you want it to have this visual kind of excitement to it. Okay, you want the experience of opening your sketchbook to feel like, unwrapping a present on Christmas Day. Okay, you want it to be revealing exciting things. So So think about that and be conscious and thoughtful about the way in which your work is presented from the moment we get to this first title page. So my title was Shapes of the City. Now, here's what we actually want you to do then in terms of your title. If we go through this, to begin with, what I've been doing is I have been collecting images. So one of the key things that you're going to need to do in response to your title and within your sketchbook is you're going to need to collect. Now, I've written here, gather images that you feel are related to your chosen title, and they should be interesting to you because of their content, their mood, or both. So in other words, how the image makes you feel, what actually is in the image, okay, or a combination of both of those things. And you can find images wherever you like, really, whether it be in books, online, in magazines, in newspapers. As long as it's possible to get a physical copy printed out or photocopied or whatever that may be, that's okay. Or you could actually physically cut it out, I guess, in magazines or newspapers if they're not precious to you. So collecting is one of the key activities for the first 2 weeks of term. Here are a bunch of images that I collected and found. Okay, these are images of arrows and signs and symbols that you typically might find around the city. Here's an image that I found again in a magazine of a kind of derelict building in a kind of disused or kind of forgotten part of the city. Here's something else that I found, which is a piece of graphic design, a little illustration from an advert in a book. And so what I've done is I've collected these things and I've stuck them down. And as we go through my sketchbook, there are other things that I've found and collected, other bits of images that I've found. So they are in there and they are presented. But you'll notice that as well as the actual images, I'm also writing things and I'm also making notes. So the second thing that's important here is to make connections between the things that you are putting in your book. So I've written here, make a list of at least 20 words that you feel are connected or linked to your chosen title. Also notice any connections between the images that you're collecting. For example, lines, colours, shapes or textures, etc. And this is the really important part, because when we make interesting connections, that's where ideas are conceived. Okay, that's where the spark of an original thought begins. Okay, when you make a thoughtful and interesting connection that maybe somebody else hasn't noticed or hasn't seen. What does that look like in your sketchbook? Here is my list of words. Okay, here is my list of 20 words connected to my theme, my Shapes of the City theme. And in case you can't read it, my list goes geometry, buildings, roads, signs, patterns, movement, trash, graffiti, derelict, abandoned, shiny. It's almost like word association, this. So I start thinking, okay, what kinds of shapes are there in the city? Okay. And I start along that line. But as I kind of get carried away, I end up with words like commercial, closed, open, because my thoughts start to shift to shops and, you know, the kind of commercial buildings and the shapes of those sorts of things. Barriers, lines, construction, bricks, stacks, walls, doors, and so on. So this is me making a whole series of connections that are going to help me with my ideas as the work develops. So that's my list of 20 words. But look here also, I've written here, like a Lego kit or a model to be assembled. Okay, because I made a little connection between that image and something else that I was thinking about. As I go through here, there are all sorts of other connections that I am making. I've written here the Jenga tower. Okay, this was something that I just kind of noticed, I spotted lying around in the house, and I thought, yeah, that's a little bit like a building, but it's unstable. And so here I've written unstable, like a political system. Remember when we were looking at the orange and I was asking you to write about that unraveling like something, or being pulled apart like something. Don't forget those questioning, kind of investigative, curious ways of thinking, because they're so important. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. Unstable like a political system, ambitious like a power station, collapsed like a way of life. Okay? And that's all come from thinking about this idea of a Jenga tower. I had a little stack of old CDs as well lying around the house, so I've made a little drawing of those here on top of a photograph and a little bit of tracing paper. And this little bit of drawing here takes me to the next element of your sketchbook, which is this. So we also want you to observe. We want you to take photographs, make drawings of objects. We might make drawings of places, people, or anything else that you find visually interesting that's got some connection to your title. If you get stuck, try going for a walk with your camera, or talking about your ideas with members of your family at home. We'll come back to the idea of going for a walk in a moment or two, but initially in my sketchbook, look, here I am making a drawing of some objects that I think are connected in some way to this idea of the shapes of the city. Okay, geometric sculptures of junk I've written here. Okay, there's a little bit of information here about the artist that made this, because that's something I found online, so I thought I'd record a little bit about the artist's work as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm starting to build and grow a whole body of research, okay, a whole load of stuff which is making my work distinctive and original. Here's another photograph. This is by this person called Sarah Pickering. I've put her photographs of abandoned streets remind me of images I have seen showing the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I don't know if anyone watched that series on TV. I was watching that at the time, and I made a connection here between the abandoned streets of this Russian city where there'd been this nuclear catastrophe in the 1980s, and it made me think about that. So there we are again. It's a connection that I'm making, okay, all the time, observing, connecting, okay, collecting. This is what development looks like at this stage. Here's a bunch more stuff. And this little piece of writing here is the kind of the fourth element, I suppose, that we would like you to be including. And this is to make sure that you explain. So it's really, really important as you're gathering stuff together. You can't always be certain that whoever's looking at your sketchbook is going to understand where you're coming from. And so the idea of explanation is really important. We want you to explain your ideas. Write a bit about your reasons for choosing the title. Explain what the title means to you as you'll start your creative journey. And when you have an idea, write it down. Okay, even a few words with bullet points can reveal complex thoughts. And you will get rewarded for those complex thoughts. Okay, when we mark your work, if you've got really clever, interesting thoughts expressed within what you've done and within the research you've created, that's worth a huge amount. And it's only with those kind of sort of insightful, complicated, interesting thought processes, not always complicated actually, sometimes it can be very, very simple, but beautifully kind of expressed and kind of elegantly noted down. Those things are really, really important. And without those things, you cannot get to the highest grades in our subject. So explanation is really, really important. In my book here, I've chosen to make the title of my project Shapes of the City because of my initial interest in drawing using the rule of two-point perspective to invent new imaginative forms in my drawing. You all did that little bit of two-point perspective drawing when we were drawing the Jenga blocks. And it may be that you've chosen your title because you think it relates nicely to things that you've already looked at. Maybe there's an artist that you've been looking at and you think, oh yeah, that's really good, and that would lend itself really nicely to the idea of movement or the idea of construction. I want to consider... Oh, sorry, no, look here. However, Shapes of the City doesn't just cover the idea of buildings and architecture. I want to consider how artists intervene with the city by creating street art on the walls of buildings. I want to explore what happens when structures change, when they are built up or torn down. Parts of the city are growing while other parts are in decline. Positive and negative construction and collapse, I've written there. Look, so actually, even though this was a year ago, what I've done in my book here could quite easily be in response to construction and collapse. I mentioned going for a walk, and here is a little walk that I went on this morning. I didn't walk very far. I walked from the outside of Fox to the bus stop outside the art gallery. I took my camera with me and I stood at the bus stop and I just took photographs. And what was great this morning are these frozen patterns of ice in the windows of the bus stop. So I became really, really interested in that, and I decided to take some photographs of it. This is a photograph of a bit of chewing gum on the floor. This is a map that had some frost over the front of it, which I scratched and scraped away. These are just little bits of leftover tape that I've stuck down onto the surface of my sketchbook and then scraped a bit of paint over. And I've drawn some of these little lines with a white oil pastel because I thought that they were similar to these lines in this photograph here. And my notes, my explanation here, apart from this little kind of cut up post-it note that I made, I've written lines, maps, journeys, cracks, pathways, scars, interruptions, boundaries, screens, barriers, arrive and depart. Okay, this idea of waiting at a bus stop and noticing all of this stuff I thought was kind of interesting. While I was there, standing at the bus stop, I made this drawing as well. I just took a handful of pens with me. And this is me trying to draw the cars and people just walking past and moving past me as I stood there, stationary. Oh, hang on. Little interruption there as the lights in the studio went out automatically. Yeah, so this is a little bit of drawing. So again, this is observing. This is a image that I made using an app which combined two of my photographs together. Okay, so that's, I think, a combination of this one and this one here. Okay, overlapped in an app, and I've scribbled and drawn on that. And here I've written a line that disobeys. I live through this line I've put. I got thinking about the fact that I can't actually just go wherever I want and do what I want at the moment. Not in real life, but actually when I started to draw over the top of this map, I thought, you know what? My line's not going to go where it's told. It's not going to follow the lines of the map. It's just going to do its own thing. And that got me thinking. I thought that was quite an interesting idea. Okay? And this is the type of thing I'm thinking about. Okay? When an idea occurs to you, write it down. And then finally, this is another kind of image like that I made using a combination of two of my photographs. Again, with a bit of scribbled drawing on top. And this last little bit here, I've just written, what other journeys might be possible? Question mark. What other lands might I explore? Now, I want you to be excited by this. Okay, I want you to get invigorated and kind of just, obsessed with this. I want you to kind of like really, really own it so that it's not just about slavishly doing what you're told, but actually you're taking control of the project, you're bringing ideas into the studio so that when Emily and I are talking to you and Richard are talking to you, we are excited by what you've got to say. Okay, you're taking control of that journey, that pathway, and our job becomes about guiding you to see the potential in the stuff that you collect. There is a balance in my book here between images and notes. We will expect to see that. And what we want from you really over the course of the first 2 weeks of term, I think it's sensible to say that we want at least 4 pages from you, okay, beginning to explore your theme in the way that I have described. Okay, so a minimum of 4, and it could be that you really start flying with this thing and you end up with more than that, but I think initially at least we want 4 pages, and those pages should contain a combination of collecting things that are relevant to your theme or that are inspiring to you in some way, making connections between your theme and other ideas in the world, explaining connections between the theme and the things that you've collected. It needs to contain some observation. So I think everybody needs to have some photography of their own, or if you've not got a printer to hand, you can make drawing. That's also fine. And in the end, you will need both of those things, so it doesn't really matter where you start. And then we also need to see some notes to explain your thinking. That's quite a long introduction, but with this video you can come back and sort of come back to this at any point. You can look through it, you can kind of come back to any particular moment in the explanation just to remind yourself what you've been asked to do. But that's it. Okay, so we are setting sail, we are setting course, we are departing from the safe shore of being told exactly what to do, and we are heading off into new uncharted waters. Okay, but therein lies the potential to discover something new, both in your own kind of ideas and in terms of, you know, things that you may want to visually express. So yeah, have fun with that. We will be speaking to you in live lessons over the next 2 weeks, so that you'll be opportunity to ask us questions as well. But initially, at least, that's the brief. Off you go.